Imagine logging onto your favorite streaming platform right now. You're just, immediately bombarded by a 10-part glossy docuseries breaking down a pop star's recent highly publicized
Okay.
breakup.
And their morning skincare routine.
Exactly. Their skincare routine, their backstage tantrums, all of it.
Right.
We live in this era where it is, honestly, virtually impossible to separate a piece of art from the actual person who made it.
Right.
You stream an album, and you are inherently buying into the artist's Instagram presence. You're buying into their political leanings, their personal feuds. I mean, it feels like we're all just subscribing to this massive, interconnected reality show, right?
Yeah, totally.
And the actual music we listen to is, like, nothing more than the background soundtrack to their personal drama.
The cult of personality has completely taken over. We just demand total visibility from creators now.
We really do.
And because of that constant demand for content and, a personal narrative, the art itself often becomes secondary to the overarching brand. You aren't just buying the song anymore.
Right. You're buying a piece of their lifestyle.
Exactly. Which is why today's deep dive is going to feel like stepping through a portal into a completely alien dimension.
Oh, I am so ready for this. We have this incredibly fascinating stack of research in front of us from monumental movement records, and our mission today is to explore the underlying philosophy of anonymity in art.
Because it's so different from how we view it today.
Right, because when we see someone hiding their identity today, it almost always feels like a cheap, engineered marketing gimmick. Like a DJ wearing a glowing helmet just to build hype and sell more merchandise.
Yeah, total stunt.
But we are going to examine how, in the 1980s underground scenes of North America, choosing to be anonymous was this profound, foundational creative choice. It wasn't a stunt to get famous.
No, not at all.
It was the absolute prerequisite for creating a masterpiece. Okay, let's unpack this. We're going on a journey to contrast the radically different ways artists in San Francisco and Quebec weaponize anonymity to completely alter the psychological experience of listening to music.
And to really grasp the gravity of this, we kind of need to set the historical stage first. Because prioritizing the art over the individual creator's ego is actually a deeply rooted tradition.
Right, it's not a new idea.
Not at all.
Yeah.
If you walk through any museum and look at religious paintings from, say, the Middle Ages in Europe, you'll notice a staggering number of them are completely unsigned.
Wow.
The artist left no trace of their identity.
Because claiming credit would be viewed as missing the entire point of the creation, right? Like slapping your name on a grand religious fresco just to say, hey, look at how talented I am, would be a supreme act of arrogance.
Exactly. The painting was meant to serve a higher spiritual purpose, or just to serve the community. It wasn't meant to act as a billboard for the painter. The individual ego was seen as a flaw, honestly, not a feature.
The message was what mattered.
Right. But then you fast forward to the 19th and 20th centuries, and the concept of the artist, with a capital A, was born.
Oh, yeah. The genius artist.
Yes, exactly. The post-war art market basically turned the creator's signature into the ultimate commodity. People started buying a sketch on a napkin, not because the sketch was profoundly moving, but simply because Picasso signed it.
The identity dictated the market value.
Precisely. And eventually you saw this massive ideological backlash against this hyper-commercialization. Avant-garde movements, conceptual art circles, and the whole sprawling DIY culture of the 60s and 70s actively rebelled against the idea that the artist's name mattered more than the work.
They desperately wanted to strip away that suffocating layer of ego.
Yeah, to return to just pure, unadulterated expression.
And that historical tension is just the perfect lens for looking at our first geographic stop today, which is San Francisco in the 1980s.
A wild time and place.
Truly. I mean, San Francisco was already this legendary combustible mix of counterculture elements. You had the lingering ghosts of the Beat generation, the remnants of the hippie movement, this fiercely independent DIY punk ethos.
In a wildly experimental performance art scene.
Yes. So in an environment that loud, where literally everyone is practically screaming to make a unique statement, I'm fascinated by how the concept of the nameless artist actually took root.
Yeah.
Because it seems counterintuitive, right? Trying to disappear in a city known for its spectacles.
Well, it does seem counterintuitive until you realize they didn't use anonymity to disappear quietly into the background.
Oh, they didn't?
No, in San Francisco, they used anonymity to create an even larger spectacle. It was a highly orchestrated theatrical performance. And the most visceral example of this, from the Monumental Movement Records research, is a notoriously avant-garde group called Caroliner.
Oh man, just reading the descriptions of Caroliner in these source materials is A genuinely overwhelming experience.
It really is.
I mean, they sound less like a band and more like a traveling circus from some dystopian future.
Overwhelming is the exact right word for them. Carolina emerged in the late 1980s, and they didn't just hide their faces. They used anonymity to construct this intricate, massive fictional mythology.
Like world building.
Exactly. When you went to see them perform, you weren't watching four human beings wearing jeans and t-shirts playing guitars. You were confronted by these towering, grotesque, elaborate masks.
Just totally surreal.
Yeah, they wore entirely handmade, almost archaic costumes.
Mhm.
And they performed on sets that looked like they were dragged out of a fever dream, covered in neon paint and strange scribbles.
And their sound totally matched that visual chaos. The sources describe it as this relentless, genre-defying collision, like harsh noise, acoustic folk instruments, free improvisation.
Just frantic punk energy.
Yeah. The way they presented themselves, it felt like they were inhabitants of some bizarre ancient society that had somehow stumbled onto a stage rather than musicians playing a gig.
Right.
I love this approach because it reminds me of a massive, immersive, alternate reality game. Or, an interactive theater piece like Sleep No More.
Oh, that's a great comparison.
Yeah, because as a fan, you're forced to become an active participant. You have to piece together this fragmented lore by analyzing their bizarre album titles, deciphering the cryptic symbols on their stage sets, reading their weird handmade posters.
Yeah.
You aren't just passively consuming a record.
You're actively participating in an archaeological dig of a fake civilization.
Exactly.
What's fascinating here is that for Carolina, anonymity was a mechanism to force the audience to become a constituent part of that shared mythical world. The illusion relies entirely on the absence of reality.
Right.
If you find out that the terrifying creature playing the banjo on stage is actually just like a guy named Dave who works at a local accounting firm,
Dave ruins the fantasy.
he totally ruins it.
Right.
The magic instantly evaporates.
The moment you introduce Dave's mundier reality, the audience stops being explorers of a myth and goes back to just being people standing in a sweaty club watching an accountant play dress up.
Exactly. Dave grounds the entire experience in our boring, everyday reality. But by actively erasing Dave, by completely obliterating any trace of their individual human identities, the joint illusion itself becomes the art.
The masks they wear aren't designed to hide the creators. The masks are the creators.
Yes. This brand of anonymity allows a sprawling, weird, chaotic myth to actually live and breathe in the room. It creates this unbreakable bond between the anonymous performers and the audience who buys into the fiction.
So if Carolina used anonymity as a megaphone to shout this massive fiction into existence, I keep wondering about the artists who don't want to build a myth at all.
The ones who just want to vanish.
Right. The
Yeah.
ones who look at that exact same San Francisco landscape and just want to evaporate. Because the research highlights another prominent act from the same era operating in the exact same experimental space called Rubber O Cement.
Oh, yes.
But their approach feels like the absolute inverse of Caroliner's theatrics.
It really is.
Yeah.
Rubber O Cement represents an entirely different philosophical application of anonymity. Where Carolina gave you a mountain of fake information and lore to sift through, Rubber O Cement provided absolutely nothing.
Literally nothing.
Zero information, no grand mythology, no elaborate costumes, no narrative hooks for the audience to latch onto.
They just left the listener completely alone with the work. And the work itself was incredibly abrasive. I mean, this wasn't ambient background music.
Oh, not at all. It was intensely challenging, heavy, collage-based audio. We are talking about densely layered, recorded materials, aggressive bursts of harsh noise, heavily fragmented sounds, and distorted environmental audio.
Very intense stuff.
Extremely.
Right.
It was intentionally stitched together in a chaotic way that actively repelled any attempt to visualize the human hands operating the tape machines.
Yeah.
The mechanics of their sound were designed to prevent human connection. And that represents the concept of autonomy. They weren't hiding behind a lack of information to create a fun, compelling mystery for the audience to solve. They were forcibly removing the question of who made this entirely from the conversation.
They completely severed the ego from the creation.
Yes, the overarching goal was the self-preservation of the art. Think about it. When you know the creator's gender, their socioeconomic background, their personal politics, or even just their fashion sense,
It changes everything.
it inherently colors how you perceive their work. You bring your own biases to the listening experience. By violently removing all of that context, Rubber O Cement allowed the sonic work to circulate completely independently. without the heavy anchor of an artist's ego weighing it down or corrupting its reception.
Here's where it gets really interesting for me, though, because I have to push back on this idea of pure autonomy just a bit.
Oh, okay, let's hear it.
I understand the philosophy of removing the ego, but isn't a total militant refusal to provide information still just another form of branding? Like, if you forcefully refuse to tell me who you are, the mystery itself becomes your defining characteristic. It feels like an anti-marketing strategy that just acts as marketing by a different name. Isn't absence just another type of presence?
Yeah, it is a very sharp critique.
Hmm.
And if we were analyzing a modern artist doing this on social media today, your theory would be entirely correct.
Because today it's all about hype.
Exactly. Today, manufactured mystery is a highly effective, deeply calculated marketing tool. But we have to analyze this strictly through the historical mechanics of the underground cassette culture of the 80s and 90s.
Right, pre-internet.
In that highly specific context, refusing to provide a biography wasn't a clever ploy to drive up engagement or get famous. The infrastructure for fame literally didn't exist for this type of music.
Oh, that's a great point.
It was a genuine philosophical stance to ensure the listener's focus remained strictly, uncomfortably locked onto the sonic experience. It was about forcing the art to survive on its own terms in a really harsh environment.
Okay, that makes sense. When we place these two San Francisco approaches side by side, it really illuminates the core tension. They are fundamentally answering the same question, which is, who owns the art once it is released into the wild?
Yeah.
Caroliner answers that question with, the shared collective fantasy owns the art. It belongs to the myth, but Rubber O Cement answers it with, the art owns itself. One builds an inclusive, interactive theater, and the other builds an impenetrable fortress.
And both are total rejections of the traditional idea that the individual artist is the permanent owner and dictator of the work's meaning.
So we've thoroughly explored how the West Coast scene used anonymity to add something to reality, either by adding characters and sweeping myths, or by adding this autonomous, standalone sonic entity that refuses to explain itself.
Right.
But what happens when anonymity is weaponized as a tool for pure subtraction? The research pivots us to the other side of the continent, specifically to Montreal, Quebec.
A completely different world.
Yeah. We're looking at a French-speaking cultural hub with a profoundly rich history of experimental and contemporary music. But what were the cultural mechanics in Quebec that caused them to handle the concept of a faceless artist so differently?
To understand the Quebec approach, you have to look at their unique cultural causality. Montreal is this francophone island in a massive anglophone continent.
Right.
That inherent linguistic and cultural insularity naturally fostered a fiercely independent, tight-knit avant-garde scene. And within that scene, survival often meant you couldn't afford to specialize. The historical boundaries between different artistic disciplines began to dissolve completely.
Dissolve in what way? Like just musicians playing multiple instruments?
No, much deeper than that. The boundary between identifying as a musician versus a fine artist became incredibly fluid. The traditional line separating a composer who sits at a desk writing sheet music and an audio engineer who manipulates tape machines in a studio basically ceased to exist.
Oh, wow.
It all merged into the broader practice of sound manipulation. And the act that perfectly embodies this philosophy from our research is Angine de Poitrine.
Angine de Poitrine. Yeah, if Carolina was a chaotic, neon-painted theater, Angine de Poitrine sounds like standing alone in a completely empty, dimly lit room where you can hear your own heartbeat.
That is an incredibly accurate psychological description. Where the San Francisco acts built loud structures, Angine de Poitrine completely faded into the background.
They just vanished.
Yeah, they stripped away all theatrics, all collages, all noise, and essentially just disappeared. The research describes their sound mechanics as a meticulous placement of microsounds, like a solitary click, a 30-second stretch of quiet tape hiss.
Deeply fractured, barely their melodies.
Exactly. Ambient environmental noise and just vast expanses of deliberate silence.
They weren't writing songs with verses and choruses. They were literally sculpting time itself.
Yes, and the mechanics of sculpting acoustic space over time demand that the creator's personality be entirely absent. If we connect this to the bigger picture, Angine de Poitrine's approach is perhaps the most perfect musical realization of the famous literary concept, introduced by the French philosopher Roland Barthes.
Ah, the death of the author.
The death of the author, exactly.
The idea that the moment a piece of art is released, the creator's original intentions are completely irrelevant. The authority transfers from the person who made it to the person experiencing it.
Right.
The reader, or in this case the listener, is the one who actually creates the final meaning.
That is the core mechanism here. By stripping away their own identity, by violently refusing to provide any context, liner notes, or explanations about what they meant, Angine de Poitrine maximizes the blank space for you, the listener.
Wow.
The meaning isn't dictated by a masked performer handing you a fake history, and it isn't dictated by an abrasive wall of noise pushing you away. The meaning is constructed entirely by how your brain attempts to find patterns in the desolate audio space they've laid out.
The psychological impact of that is fascinating. Like if I'm sitting in my living room listening to Angine de Poitrine, and I hear a faint metallic hum followed by a sharp click.
Yeah.
And my brain instantly connects that sound to the radiator in my childhood bedroom, bringing up this wave of specific nostalgia that becomes the absolute correct interpretation of the art.
Exactly.
The art isn't trying to tell me a story, it's acting as a flawless mirror, reflecting my own psychology back at me.
And this is exactly why the artist must remain anonymous. Because if you were to read an interview where the creator of Angine de Poitrine explained that they actually recorded that specific metallic hum in a decaying subway station to make a pointed political statement about urban infrastructure.
Oh, my childhood radiator connection is instantly destroyed.
Completely destroyed. The author's stated intent crushes the listener's imagination.
Yeah.
In Montreal, anonymity wasn't just an aesthetic choice. It was an invisible shield designed specifically to protect your absolute right to interpret the art however you see fit.
It perfectly illustrates how geographical and cultural differences shape these movements. San Francisco used anonymity to aggressively build outwards, constructing worlds and abrasive noise structures. Quebec used anonymity to aggressively subtract inwards,
Stripping away the creative.
stripping away the ego and even stripping away the dense layers of sound, leaving nothing but pure acoustic space and the listener's own imagination.
It proves that anonymity is not a single, one-dimensional tactic. It's a vast philosophical workshop with entirely different tools depending on what you're trying to build.
The underlying philosophy here makes complete sense to me, stripping away the ego to protect the purity of the art. But honestly, the logistics of this are breaking my brain a little bit.
How so?
Well, if I am an artist in the 1980s or 90s operating entirely pre-internet, and I refuse to show my face, I refuse to do press, and sometimes refuse to even give you my real name, how does this music actually circulate? Because this philosophy of facelessness sounds beautiful in an isolated room, but music is inherently meant to be shared. You can't rely on a charismatic interview or a viral algorithm. So how did these completely anonymous entities actually build a global following?
It requires a paradigm shift in how we think about distribution. There was a highly efficient, sprawling underground infrastructure that made this entirely possible, driven purely by the ethos of DIY culture.
Okay.
Small, hyper-dedicated communities took on every single logistical role themselves. We were talking about grassroots networks handling the recording, the physical design of the artwork, the pressing, the promotion, and the global distribution,
Completely bypassing the mainstream system.
all operating in total defiance of the major corporate record label system, yes.
And the lifeblood, like the absolute technological foundation of this entire global network, was the cassette tape.
The cassette tape was a deeply democratic, revolutionary medium. The physical mechanics of the tape perfectly aligned with the philosophy of the music.
Because they were so accessible.
Exactly. Blank tapes were incredibly cheap to acquire in bulk. You could duplicate them in small, controlled batches right in your living room using a dual-deck boombox. And crucially, magnetic tape is highly forgiving of rough, lo-fi audio quality.
You didn't need thousands of dollars of studio time to make it sound pristine. The tape hiss, the slight warping, the natural audio decay. That physical texture actually enhanced the aesthetic of bands like Carolina or Rubber O Cement.
It became part of the art.
Yeah. But what fascinates me most is the philosophy of trust that this physical network required. Because you aren't just clicking a streaming link and instantly deciding if you like a song in 5 seconds.
No, engaging with this network was a slow, deeply tactile physical commitment.
You might read a 2-sentence review in a photocopied, staple-bound fanzine about some bizarre tape from Montreal. You have to physically go to the post office, purchase a money order, write a letter, and mail it internationally.
And then you wait.
You wait, sometimes for months. And when that small, padded envelope finally arrives, containing a cassette with a hand-drawn abstract cover and zero artist biography. I mean, it is a profoundly personal exchange, yet entirely devoid of personal identity.
That blind physical exchange is the exact mechanism that allowed anonymity to thrive. In a postal network, a charismatic face or an engaging personal backstory is totally useless currency. The true underlying currency of that entire global network was aesthetic reliability and trust.
You weren't trusting the artist, you were trusting the curation.
Exactly. You built trust through the consistent quality of the work. If a small, independent label in San Francisco consistently mailed you incredible, challenging tapes, you trusted their catalog implicitly.
Right.
The anonymity of the individual artist wasn't a barrier to entry, it was a core feature of the system. The distribution network was mechanically designed to evaluate the art entirely on its own sonic merits. The system didn't care if the artist was conventionally attractive or if they had a compelling trauma narrative to sell.
It only cared about what was magnetically imprinted on the tape.
Yes.
So what does this all mean for us right now? Because the reality is we are living in the absolute antithesis of that cassette network.
We really are.
From a purely technological standpoint, creating and distributing art is easier than it has ever been in the history of human civilization. You can record a pristine album on your smartphone in an afternoon and distribute it globally with one click.
True.
But trying to avoid the spotlight, trying to separate your physical self from the art, that is incredibly difficult.
It is nearly impossible to achieve any kind of reach without capitulating to the demands of visibility.
Right, because the algorithms that control global distribution today do not prioritize aesthetic reliability. They demand constant, unrelenting personal visibility.
They want the creator, not just the creation.
Yeah, they require the artist to make short-form videos explaining the emotional trauma behind their lyrics, showing off their morning routine, or awkwardly lip-syncing to their own tracks in their bedroom. The modern infrastructure demands endless content creation, not just art creation.
This raises an important question about the modern paradox of anonymity. In the 1980s and 90s, as we've discussed, choosing to be anonymous was a philosophical choice, yes, but it was also a perfectly natural, frictionless fit for the mechanics of mail-order cassette distribution.
It made sense for the time.
It aligned seamlessly with how the underground functioned. But today, choosing to be a truly anonymous creator is an aggressive, hostile, rebellious act. It is a direct refusal to participate in a culture that mandates personal branding as the price of admission.
It is a loud statement. It's an artist looking at the machine and saying, I refuse to feed you.
And when a creator successfully pulls that off today, it proves a vital, timeless point, that an artist's fame, their face, their carefully curated personal lore, and the actual profound value of their work are not inextricably linked. It proves that you can still experience world-shifting, life-changing art without needing to know a single thing about the human being who made it.
It's a jarring thought, honestly. We have been so deeply conditioned by algorithms to desire the entire package. We want the art, but we also feel entitled to the artist's personal lore and daily life. It's hard to untangle the two.
It takes effort.
It really does.
Yeah.
But I want to leave you, our listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over as you go about your day. The next time you discover a new favorite song, or read a book that completely rewires your brain, or stand in front of a piece of art that you just cannot pull your eyes away from, ask yourself a question.
A mental stress test for how you consume media.
Exactly. Would your profound emotional reaction to this piece of art change if you suddenly found out it was created by someone entirely different, someone whose politics or lifestyle you completely disagreed with? Or what if you found out it was created by no one you could ever possibly identify, just a nameless, faceless entity who dropped this masterpiece into the world and permanently vanished? Are you actually falling in love with the art itself, or are you just falling in love with the story the artist is selling you?